a workshop, obviously, for the council to discuss financing options for the new city hall. The public's welcome to join us and listen, though I don't anticipate we're going to take any public comment today, and we're not making any decisions. We're just having a discussion among ourselves on various options here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Layla.
Great. Thanks, Mayor. Hello, everyone. I've invited back again today with us John Peterson from Piper Sandler. And I decided to dedicate the whole of our workshop today to discussing kind of City Hall financing, because I feel like we need some time to sort of go through what our next steps are. And I also think that probably from this discussion, there'll be some sort of additional follow-up items. So I didn't want to give the discussion short shrift. We may not need the whole time, but I wanted the council to have the opportunity to have the whole time, because this is an important discussion. So I think the way I'd like to do this is, so we have John here right now, and out of respect for his time too, I'm having him kind of on the front end of this. And what I've asked him to do is pull together sort of the possible and the prudent. So we talked a lot about the different types of bonds and opportunities for us to take out debt. And so John's been a little bit of work on that, and I've asked him to kind of come and share his perspective on what would be prudent for us. And so I've asked him to kind of put together some slides, and I'd like to give him the floor to go through that, and then pause after his presentation and have council, if there's any questions that you have specifically of John, to try to address those now early in the presentation. And then I have sort of a follow-up to that to help guide our discussion moving forward. But just want to be respectful of John's time and also provide the council with an opportunity to tap into his expertise to the greatest extent possible. So unless there's any questions, I think, John, I'm going to hand it over to you to go through your sort of slide deck and kind of walk us through that. And I trust that you'd be open to hearing any questions as you go throughout. So why don't I go ahead and hand over the baton to you, John?
Great. Should I share the presentation from my computer, or were you going to throw those up? I'm fine either way.
Why don't you go ahead and do it, because I'm actually having some technical difficulties on my end.
Okay, let's see if I can. All of a sudden, it seems like I don't know how to do standard. Let's go here. All right. Am I sharing screen with you guys yet? Not yet. Let's see if I click share screen. That's what I want to share. There we go. So this is, I'm calling this a Bonds 101 follow-up. It's incorporating the fundamental principles of municipal finance and bond issuance from last time, and then connecting that to really, how do you measure your, I guess, financing capacity? And I wanted to talk about, there are some legal limits. There are I suppose some market limits outside of legal limits, and then really the most important limit for the council to consider is really what is prudent. What is the best way to allocate city resources? What is a responsible amount to borrow? So I will think the first slide will be similar to something that you've already seen. Although suddenly it's not. There we go, advancing for me. Okay, so from last time we talked about, what are the legal limits for borrowing? Cities can issue general obligation bonds totaling no more than 3% of the real market value. Limits for borrowing all taxable property in the city's jurisdiction. That for certain what we could call critical infrastructure needs, that limit does not even apply. So general obligations for water, supply, treatment, distribution, any kind of sanitary or storm sewers, healthcare needs, power needs, and oddly enough, even parking, which anyway. I don't know if that was part of some boondoggle that got included in the statute so that someone could build a really expensive parking facility. But at any rate, for certain things, you're not even subject to the 3% limit. And also for full faith and credit obligations or revenue bonds, the 3% limit does not apply. Some city charters do limit that amount of borrowing. The city of Manzanita's charter does not have a limit on revenue or full faith and credit debt. We move on to the next question is how much should you borrow? Kind of the possible versus the prudent. We talked about some things aren't even subject to the 3% limit on general obligation bonds, but for those things that are, that represents about 28 million that the city could borrow for a given general obligation bond that they would seek voter approval for. And again, that amount would be unlimited for certain essential projects. It's also possible for the city to borrow, a theoretically unlimited amount under your full faith and credit obligation authority. But we switch from what's possible to what is prudent. And actually, the first sentence that I have here is a connection between the possible and the prudent in the middle. You have to be able to pay it back. There is probably an amount that you can pay back that still wouldn't be very enjoyable to pay back. And so that's the next point. I said, from a prudence standpoint, any cuts or substitutions that you'd have to make in order to meet your debt service should be less important than the project itself. In other words, if you have to make trade-offs, you want the trade-offs to be ones you've considered and agreed on. One of the nice things that you have going for you at the city of Manzanita is a pretty long-standing record of running general fund surpluses. In other words, you're not, I think, regularly having to figure out what to cut. You're not in that kind of dire straits where you're trying to figure out how you can possibly finance something because the resources aren't there. You've actually been running surpluses pretty steadily. I think that's due to prudent fiscal management and frankly, perhaps more due to really, really solid revenues coming from your hotel and lodging taxes. I think a reasonable benchmark for, I would call it an upper benchmark for annual debt service would be to look back 5 years and the lowest surplus over that 5 years, rather than an average surplus would be a higher number than your lowest. But your lowest surplus you could look at as kind of an upper bound of debt service that you would anticipate being able to make without having to enact any trade-offs, at least in terms of annual operations and the kinds of capital funding that you've been doing so far with transfers from the general fund to other funds. And I think the lowest in the last 5 years was a surplus of 554,000 approximately. And if you were to borrow over 20 years, that could service about $8 million in full faith and credit obligations. Over 30 years, it would be more. I think a little less than 12 million. But I'm not recommending going neither going really long nor going really high. I think there's some kind of value in looking at the projects that you might undertake, looking at your surpluses and then assigning values to the things that you might do, and setting yourself up to be comfortable continuing to do other high value projects while paying the financing on something that is simply too large of a project to do on a pay-as-you-go basis. That's kind of the point of bond financing, is to accomplish something that would cost too much for you to take it out of an annual budget or to save up for in a relatively short period of time. That was a whole lot of information, and I welcome any questions. I think another, and it's kind of a prudence thing rather than a positive thing, but when you're borrowing on a tax exempt basis, you also need to borrow a small enough amount that you can reasonably expect to spend 85% of it within 3 years. In other words, the federal government doesn't like allowing investors to collect interest-free bonds for government projects that aren't getting built. They're willing to allow investors to collect tax-free interest payments on public projects that are getting built, and they've set up some rules around that. And one part of it is the reasonable expectation to spend 85% of proceeds in 3 years. There may be a case when tax exempt and taxable rates are very close to each other that it would make sense to go ahead and borrow on a taxable basis and keep the funds invested because you wanted to take advantage of a low borrowing cost and have some flexibility and certainty. But I'm not recommending that here. I think I'm just trying to paint a relatively full picture. And then turn to you all for questions, and I can go back to any slide if you'd like. I guess I didn't start with the important thing. Thank you, Mayor Scott and members of the council and Layla for having me with you today. Glad to be able to visit with you.
John, I just have a question. So you mentioned other potential high value projects that we need to sort of assign value to, and I want to make sure. So when you looked at our books and are telling us how well off we are, and I appreciate that, and it's a good thing we are. But have you looked at sort of the relative needs of these other potential projects, or?
Oh, I sure have not.
Okay.
I have not. I think there are, kind of political considerations around that decide what's, I mean, if all of a sudden the sanitary system, I don't know how many of your residents are on septic rather than sewer, maybe it's a lot. If all of a sudden there's failures all over the place and it stinks and no one's coming to Manzanita, it's pretty easy to get people organized and motivated to do something to fix the smell. Golly, I shouldn't speak these kinds of things or they might come into existence, I guess. But, certainly there are different things can be more important for different reasons. Leadership can have an impact on what people think is most important. Negative leadership can also do that. Really there's any number of potential things that you might be doing. I haven't been evaluating that, and I'm not a political consultant, but I am a financial consultant, and I think giving yourself some breathing room is virtually always a good idea. And there are things that come up where you're actually having to do the financing in order to get breathing room, but that's a different case.
Well, one other question, I guess, is I get that we've historically run surpluses, and some of that is due to just good conservative fiscal management. But the other factor, as you mentioned, is the room tax, which has been surging, particularly the last couple of years. And I just wonder, you talked about sort of a look back period to get a sense of, using the low surplus in that 5-year look back period. How do we account for the unknown in the future? When theoretically, part of the boost we think in room tax lately has been COVID inspired. COVID goes away, maybe the numbers drop. So how do we look forward as well as looking back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's part of the reasoning. Typically, when we're doing presentations to rating agencies, they want to see a 5-year trend. We don't typically show longer than that. I mean, I think it's worth looking farther back, and maybe you could evaluate. Although, I mean, COVID has had an impact probably on you all since I would say spring of 2020. No one was going anywhere, but maybe in summer people started showing up in droves and working from. Why not work from the coast instead of from your cramped house somewhere when you can't go to your office? those kinds of things. And maybe some of the patronage is coming from people who had additional cash paid to them by the government, and they could spend it on recreation or going to a beautiful place, rather than something else. But certainly, the number from the low number, and I think, is that one from 4 years ago or three? I think 4 years ago. So it was fiscal 17 or 18, 17 maybe. That's certainly pre any COVID impact. And I just kind of, ultimately the council can decide what they're comfortable with. I just think that that's a pretty much a safe number, to look at it. In theory, if you can look forward with some confidence that your revenues will continue or at least stabilize, and you can look at, are there other debts of the city that might be retired, because that obviously creates capacity, or that's ongoing capacity for debt service that hasn't been used for other program needs. Those kind of factors. I had a professor in 2003 who talked about kind of the looking at the cost of money and the value of projects, and theoretically, of course, he's an economist, and he always wanted maximum utility and efficiency. And his theory was, so long as you had projects that had a higher net present value if completed than the cost of the funds to complete the projects, well, then you ought to be doing all of those projects. And I would say most municipalities proceed, nowhere near that close to the edge, and some go over it accidentally, because they thought a project was going to have a super high value, and then it turned out not to. I think sometimes with conference centers, expo centers or arenas for sports, some of those things, in fact, have not turned out to produce the kind of revenues that people thought. And so they end up, pretty dissatisfied. Anyway, I think there's a case of a parking garage actually in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that was, an enormous investment and did not end up driving the revenue that they thought it would. Anyway,
John,
oh, go ahead, Steve.
just to follow up to something you just commented on about other projects and things. Can you talk a little bit about the benefit of bundling projects into a single bond offering, if that's even something you would want to do? If you
Sure.
were to retire an existing debt to either get a better, more favorable rate or extend the terms, particularly if you have an existing debt that could ultimately pay the annual based upon what you're paying currently for a different debt. And then the other
Sure.
thing that I would ask you follow up with is, with the Fed making the decision to probably, who knows, start monkeying around, what impact is that going to have on us from a bond perspective?
Sure.
And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but if you have something you want to say about that.
Sure. Well, I definitely don't have a crystal ball, or I would have borrowed as much as I could possibly borrow in order to invest as much as I could possibly invest. But interestingly, the Fed, is signaling that they're going to raise rates. We've seen some response in the bond markets. What has happened in the past? Well, it's happened twice in my career, is because the Fed signals that they're going to raise rates, and because a lot of the money flying around the economy is actually short-term borrowing by corporations and other entities, the increase in rates on the short end reduces cash flying around in the economy and helps to fight inflation. And because it has been typically successful in reducing expectations of inflation, which are the primary driver of inflation, is the expectation of inflation, what we'll end up seeing is that the long-term rates actually stay flat or even come down, and the short-term rates come up, and then you reach a point where there's a yield curve where the short-term rates are the lowest and typically the long-term rates are the highest. When the Fed raises the short-term rates enough that they can actually be higher than the long-term rates, they call that an inverted yield curve. And I think that has predicted 9 out of the last 7 recessions. So it's kind of, the Fed has slowed the flow of money enough that almost invariably, it doesn't always go into recession, but it most typically has gone into recession. And both of those things, I mean, there's a negative impact for the city in that a recession is probably not good for TLT, right? Your transient lodging tax. But it, in all likelihood, would mean a much lower borrowing cost in the long term, and probably lower costs to complete your project in terms of both materials and labor, experts, etc. So yeah, I mean, the Fed raising rates, I think if you were looking to refinance something that only goes out 3 years, then the Fed raising rates is kind of bad news for that, because it's those rates that are going up. But something that you're only paying interest on for 3 years, the interest rate has the least impact. So I think actually if the Fed raises rates at the right time, it's very good for long-term borrowers, typically.
And the bundling of
Yes, sorry, I should get to that question as well. There are some economies of scale in doing a borrowing only once. There's certain, some of the costs are variable. My firm as underwriter typically is paid a percentage, a small, tiny percentage of the par amount. And so as the size goes up, our fee actually also typically goes up. Bond counsel is not, that's the attorneys, they're not tied in the same way. And so their fees don't go up proportionally with the par amount. So you do get some savings, and definitely having them involved and us involved twice on 2 small borrowings would cost more than on 1 slightly larger borrowing. There's also not insignificant amount of workload for city staff to prepare the documentation for an official statement, and also for presenting to the rating agencies. And so doing that only once instead of twice, I think is also pretty beneficial. And to the extent that you have existing debt that you can refinance at a lower rate, we calculate all of that on a fully net basis. So in other words, we look at the savings in debt service, use a discount factor to assign a present value to that savings, and then subtract all of the allocable issuance costs. So our fees, bond attorneys, ratings, etc. All that is subtracted from the present value of the cash flow savings to come up with what we call a net present value savings number. And we try to really make those things, a simple, I guess, a clear economic picture of what the impact would be, so that the city can evaluate. Sometimes, if you have debt that you could right now refinance at any time you want, and once you refinance it, you couldn't do that again, then there may be a reason, like for instance, if you had uncertainty about what structure you wanted for your debt, you may want to delay that refinancing until you know what structure you want, rather than locking yourself into something. So those could be non-economic but strategic considerations in deciding to go ahead with something like that. But it's certainly advantageous if you're going through the work, the work and the process of financing one thing, if you have other projects that you could finance as well, especially when you're looking at a all-in borrowing cost of maybe 3% or less. It makes a lot of sense to go ahead and finance that. Although full disclosure, I'm a bond underwriter and I love to sell bonds, and so as long as it's prudent, I almost always want you to do it. So
Well, and I appreciate that. My only thought was that we don't, that we need to be as, we need to look at all aspects of it and,
Mhm.
Not get so singularly focused on a building that we fail to take advantage of other opportunities.
That makes sense.
John, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Could you just speak generally to prepayment? If there are any special prepayment considerations, both as a lump sum, or you mentioned other debts being retired. And so I'm in either situation where maybe there was a lump sum prepayment in partial or in full, or an accelerated repayment based on changes to cash flow. Are there important considerations for us about those?
Sure. My screen is not showing me who's talking, so
It's Hans Tonjes, City Councilor.
hi there, Tom's. Typically with a bond issue, you have investors, municipal investors typically have full, what we call prepayment protection or call protection for the first 10 years. In other words, the first 10 years of bonds maturing are not prepayable. They can be defeased by essentially putting funds in a treasury secured escrow that will pay the debt service through what we call the call date or the optional prepayment date. Although we can do borrowings with callable anytime, callable in 3 years, callable in 5 years. Certainly when you have banks investing, they do all kinds of their own derivative instruments where you're not entering into a derivatives contract, but they are doing different things to protect themselves on the back end, and they can offer different call features and quote you a price. It almost always saves you money to have it less flexible for you than not. But again, I think it's critical to have kind of an eye on future needs and shaping your structure, in the way that makes the most sense given what you have. And if within that you're conservative, then I think you're typically in pretty good shape.
Thank you.
You bet.
Do you have any other questions for John? Okay, Layla, what are we doing next then?
Okay, well, I actually have a presentation I wanted to walk through just to incite some more conversation around this. I think, John, maybe you could stop sharing and I'll take over the reins.
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really helpful. And you're welcome to hang out for as long as you like.
You're very welcome. Well, I think your presentation might spur some questions for me, so why don't I plan to stay on for at least a little while.
Okay, great.
So that I'm available as a resource. I don't want you to end up with 7 questions for me, and then I have to handle emails and not,
I appreciate
not satisfy
that.
anybody. Of course, I should say you're welcome to email me anytime with additional questions, but I'd rather answer things early if I can. So I will.
Awesome.
Oh, stop share happened for me. That's great.
I did it for you.
Okay.
Okay, now I need Nina to let me share. Let me see. Hang on. I think I can just do it. All right, cool. All right, so part due. Then DEUX. Okay. So you can see mine screen, I presume. Okay, so what I'm hoping to get to today is I'm going to start with the meeting objectives and end with the meeting objectives and go through some information in between. But what I'm hoping to get to today is at least some starting of a direction on debt tolerance. Because what I need to do then is go back and look at about how this fits in with the overall budget. So it's one piece of a much bigger puzzle that, as you can imagine, is currently in motion. So Nina and I have already started working on the budget. I'll have an update for City Council in March with the schedule, but this is one piece that fits into that. My goal would be, and I think that the most prudent thing for council to do would be to get to a place where we have sort of a range, and then I can put together a proposal so that what we put forward in the budget kind of covers any future potential debt service we might take on. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I would like some input from all of you on kind of guiding principles should you decide to take out debt. And I want to be really clear that you're not committing to take out debt today. You're not, what you're trying to do is I want to give you some financial information, share some observations that I have based on my review of our financial statements, feedback from John and others about kind of what seems like a reasonable number. And then any other guardrails that you want us to consider or talk through. I'd really like to hear your thoughts about that. I think as we start to talk about the financing of this project, other policy issues are going to come up. And I want to be able to sort of unearth those with you and then talk about where we should talk about them in the future, because we may not be able to solve everything today, but I just want to recognize that other policy issues may come up as we start to talk about this. And then start brainstorming on potentially other funding sources we can consider in addition to debt and our existing equity. So I just do want to highlight too that debt is really only part of the overall equation. Like our capital stack, so to speak, will be made up of a number of different resources, and we're still in the process of figuring that out. Debt financing will be a portion of that. We have equity in the form of cash in our existing City Hall fund, as well as potentially the proceeds from old City Hall, and then other resources. So we have a certain percentage of interest earned that goes into that account. There's potential for grants depending on what the development program is for the building, potentially energy incentives and other things that we can explore as we start to move through the project. Fundraising is a potential, and then other ideas. So I just would like an opportunity to discuss that a little bit more in depth with council and certainly members of the community. I've received a couple emails, I think, from folks about things like, hey, if you're interested in emergency operations, here are some grants. And so I just want folks to know that we're not just figuring, debt is not the only piece of it, but it is going to be a very significant part of it. So a few guiding principles just to put a bug in your ear and a starting point for discussion, and just kind of what I've seen based on my review of the financial reports, and again, talking with John and the auditor, we can pay the mortgage within our current resources. And I think it's really important, and I said this in the State of the City, but that, we need to be able to pay for our house. We need to be able to pay for, it's not an unreasonable ask for the city to use its existing resources to pay the mortgage, essentially. I think many of us are privileged to have a home of our own. Many of us had to take out debt in order to buy a home. And it's not uncommon for businesses or organizations or government entities to have a similar thing. And taking debt out is a completely normal part of that. It's not, I know there's been quite a bit of criticism about that, but oftentimes the interest rates we're paying on debt is lower than the rate of inflation. And so even though we are paying money to have money, it's sort of like that time value of money principle, right? It's worth more to you today than it is tomorrow. So, I just want to kind of make sure that folks know that it's actually sometimes good to even take debt out, because as we know as private individuals, that having credit makes us more credit worthy. And so I'm not advocating that we take out a whole bunch of debt, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward, but I just want to kind of lay that groundwork that there's a lot of perception about it being a negative. And I just think that's a bit hyperbole, because it is common. We just have to do it thoughtfully and kind of take into consideration all the factors we've talked about thus far. We have a solid safety net. We have our auditor coming tonight to talk through our most recent financial report ending last fiscal year. But the end of last fiscal year, sorry, there's a little typo there, but it should be at the end of 6/30/2021, we had, $1.25 million in unexpended general fund. And that means, our operating expenses were 1.35. So we're roughly have a year of operating expenses in savings. And that, and talking to the auditor, is like the ideal situation for a city to be in. She's like, I hope for cities to have like 6 months. And so we'll see where we stand at the end of this fiscal year. From what I'm seeing, you know, we're going to be fine. We're going to be kind of within that that range. So I just want to highlight that we are really in a pretty darn strong financial position right now, and I want to keep it that way. I would like for us to get to a point where we can plan for ongoing debt payments starting with the next budget cycle, and that seems like the appropriate process to go through is kind of go through the budgeting process with all of you to do that. And then I think we find our best opportunities to offset the debt service. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Again, it's just a little bit of a dance with the budget and trying to find ways to absorb additional debt service over the next several years without really hugely increasing our spending and dipping into that underexpend and underestimate of revenue. And what I'm talking about is the excess of revenue over expenses. So that's where we underestimated revenue and we did not spend our expenses fully and what's left at the end of the year. And you can see, I looked back before the previous recession to kind of see how that affected us. And so what that shows is starting basically in 2007, and this is all everything. So this isn't just TLT, but it's everything. You can see there's been a pretty upward trend towards strength. And so as John mentioned, in the last 5 years, kind of the lowest number we've had is $554,000 of this excess revenue over expenses. And I just ran some averages for what it's worth, but you know, the 5-year average, so if we look at 5 years of revenue and divide it by 5, you know, we're on the upwards of $640,000. And if you look at the 15-year average, we're averaging at about $368,000 of excess revenue. So to me, I just thought that would be helpful information for the council to see as we start to consider what additional, you know, how much do we want to dip into that in order to help cover not only the cost of this, but you all have mentioned like, well, what other projects? And so those are things that we need to talk about as we go through the budget process. I did want to highlight that the major transfers we have, and I highlighted what those transfers have been for the last 4 years, have gone into the road fund, the City Hall expansion fund, and the storm drain facilities fund. I want to point out that the general fund has subsidized infrastructure for decades. I mean, and we all know this. And SDCs have either been non-existent, so we don't have system development charges for transportation, or extremely low. So our storm drain SDC, I think, has been in place since 1997. It's $174 per unit. And parks are $60 per unit. So we subsidize the heck out of these things. And I don't believe that it's appropriate, and I'm totally open to hearing what council has to say, for us to suggest changing this at the moment, because we need to figure out how to fund infrastructure. But I do think it's important to point out that we have been budgeting for the City Hall expansion fund, and that pays the debt service on Underhill Plaza. And what I want to point out is that that debt service will be paid off at the end of the calendar year of 2027, so the second quarter of fiscal year 28. And once that debt's retired, we could essentially, as John was mentioning, that retired debt service could essentially then replace whatever additional resources we assign to cover debt service to construct the City Hall. So I just kind of want to point that out, as we have an ongoing obligation. We budgeted for that obligation. We have that $155,400 to pay for the next 5 years. Once that debt service goes away, that could then go into servicing the debt for City Hall, and we would recover effectively that $150,000 back. So I did want to highlight there. And this is just my pitch. I've mentioned this a couple times, but we need to act. And I think that this is just a reminder to all of us that, you know, we do need to find additional resources for infrastructure maintenance and system development. Like, we know that it's part of what I'm hoping to work with this long-term budget committee to start to look at those things. And we need to develop new funding mechanisms for infrastructure that it's not mutually exclusive with the city hall. We need to be able to do both. We need to be able to pay our mortgage, sustain our city operations and continue to work, and find solutions to these infrastructure problems, because we cannot continue to kick the can down the road. We have been doing this for 30 years. And I thought it was a fun fact to share. One of the neat things, I guess, about having paper documents is as you're going through the records, you find cool old things. I found a letter from back in the day where the city in 1996 reached out to Underhill Plaza owners to try to acquire that property. And I just thought that was an interesting thing that now here we are, 25, 26 years later, we've acquired the property and now we're trying to build it. So we have the opportunity to deliver on something that the city has been talking about for 30 years. And I feel, as I've been sitting in this seat for 7 months now, why it's so important that we get that facility. And I think the thing too, we have to reconcile is we've been charging the same for parks and stormwater SDCs since '96. And I think this council will probably agree that it's time to start looking at that. And so, in fact, I have Dan Weitzel, our public works director, we are kicking off a study for stormwater SDCs. And so more to come on that, but we just kicked that off last week. So I just kind of want to put that out there again as fodder for discussion, but I firmly believe we need to do both, and we can handle what we have based on what we're kind of already earning. So again, just to get you thinking, debt tolerance, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have any input on guiding principles for us to take out debt? Are there other guardrails we should consider and other policy issues that come to mind and other funding sources that we should consider? And with that, I'll stop sharing. And if folks want to see a slide again, I can pop back to that. But I just said a lot. And while we have the benefit of John here, would ask if you have any questions about what I said that John could chime in on. Just feel free to jump in.
Well, I have some questions, but I don't think they are John questions, so I don't want to take his time.
Well, I guess I will just reiterate the reason for my question initially was in terms of bundling things. Based on the city manager's information there, I just did a quick calculation. It looks like about 700,000 or so left on the property to pay, which would free up $155,000 of annual payment that's currently obligated to the budget. It just seems to make some sense to me that we do some kind of a bundle and use those monies, which would have basically no impact on the current funding strategy. Doesn't help you ensure that something down the road doesn't happen, but it does allow you to continue with the current level of services without seeing any kind of influence on the general fund. So that was the reason of my question, and thank you, Layla. You just kind of helped to frame that better, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and it's something, John, maybe we can explore together as we start to look at different scenarios, because I imagine I'd need to share with you sort of the debt structure we have on that loan, what's left, and then so we can look into that, Councilor Nuttall, and I can work with John to see if that would be advantageous for the city to consider what a bundle might look like. What do you think, John?
I might contribute that refinancing the $700,000 just on their own, especially with it all coming due within the next 4 years, it might be difficult to get much real savings if it weren't bundled with another issue, just because the costs of doing a financing are spread across the total financing. And if you had a total financing of only 700,000, then obviously it's having to absorb all those costs. Whereas if it's included, say in a financing that was already well, 6.3 million, for example, then your total financing would be, 7 million. So that 700,000 would only be allocated 10% of the costs. So your savings would be greater. But, we can certainly look at that. And Layla, if you'll send me the borrowing documents that you have, I can look at, what the prepayment conditions might be. I typically they're pretty good on these kinds of financings, but I have run into some that were pretty onerous. I'm looking at one for a city right now that they can only prepay. They have basically a yield maintenance clause in there that if they want to prepay, they have to fund. They have to fund with treasuries effectively the amount that the present value of the amount that would have been paid. So it's there's no economic savings to them in paying it off, basically. But I don't think that would be the case here. I'll have to take a look though.
Can I also add, you're asking about what's our tolerance, and for me personally, that's really hard right now because I feel like there's a lot of information that we don't actually have. So, I mean, if I was to say, what's my tolerance? Well, my tolerance is that we can afford it and that it provides a safe, efficient, all the things that we've been talking about. But we don't know the answers to a lot of things like, what is it going to cost to provide a safe, efficient, and does that fall within my budget tolerance? So, if you're thinking you want a number, I think that's pretty tough to come by. The tolerance is that we can afford it without undue stress on both the budget and the community. Because I think for the most part, most folks, including the council members, believe we need to do something to replace what now is a non-existent city hall. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to convey.
Oh, totally. And I think, and if we can't land on a number, I think that's okay. What would probably be beneficial, because I understand, I totally get what you're saying, and it's a very valid point. And it's, as I was saying, it's like there's this puzzle, right? There's all these different pieces that feed into this. I think getting us to a range that makes sense will be a good starting point so that I can start to see how can I start to answer those questions. And if I can just sort of throw out, a number is that kind of looking at the budget myself, I think the debt service obligation, in addition to what we're doing now, between 150 and 250,000 max would be, to me, the sort of top end that allows us to maintain about a year's worth of savings, which allows us to address kind of those unknown things. That's the point of having, that savings account, right? As our financial planners say, have 6 months of savings, and then everything else is, don't ever touch that. And then everything else on top, you start to allocate. So that might be one way. And then I can look at that in the context of everything else, because as a city, we have other things we have to be thinking about, as I think you're alluding to, which is other projects we're considering, and so forth. And so what I'm kind of edging towards is a starting point so that I can put together a budget proposal where you would have the opportunity to see how that fits in with all of these other factors.
So what does 155 generate for us, John?
Oh, you're muted, John.
It's all proportional. I did want to say, I used a little bit of cushion in what I included in my presentation. I assumed a rate of about 3% all in. Rates are a little lower than that right now. We don't like to present, here's what they are right now, and then rates go up and everyone's angry. But I think 155 would get you in the 3 million-ish range.
Okay, thanks. Over 20 years. You're still muted.
I was just saying I'll calculate that for you right now. Hold on just a second.
Okay, but we were talking 20 years, right? Okay.
Yeah, and if council has, while John's doing math, thoughts on, length of the debt service, like, let me know what you're thinking about any of that. That's all helpful for me as I look at the different options for you.
So Layla, one of my concerns is I don't think you'd get an argument from anybody on council that we've kicked the can down the road too long on SDCs, and that's hopefully something that we'll get to in due time. But and this is because I'm new on council, I may not have the perspective or the length of the knowledge of these projects that others have. But I'm wondering if we've actually been kicking the can on the actual projects. I mean, I don't really know. When we say that we've got storm drainage issues, we've got road issues, we've got water issues, but I don't really know the urgency, the level of urgency on all of those. And I can look at the numbers and see what's currently sitting in those funds, but I don't really know how bad things are with storm drains, or how bad things are with roads or the water system. And I'm wondering if there's a way to get us, maybe it's just me, but to get us up to speed on at least knowing where the urgency lies in those different arenas.
Yeah, we can work on that. And again, that'll be one of the wonderful things when we have a capital improvement plan, because you'll be able to see what that project list looks like 5 years out. Dan does have a pretty extensive list of capital projects that we are starting to work on as we prepare for the budget. So we'll take those into consideration, and as part of our kind of next steps, we can highlight what those big capital projects are, so that we can answer that for you. And I think that also helps address kind of the issues of related to, we need to update our system development charges.
And then building off of, I think, what Steve was getting at, to some extent, our tolerance for debt. So I love your analogy. It's very easy to relate to the whole mortgage analogy, but some people find out how much they can borrow, and then they buy a house at that upper limit. Other people like to know what they're able to borrow, but their tolerance for spending is reached through a different calculus. And so, how do we do this dance time-wise, where we're moving down the tracks on the City Hall project? We're getting closer to the point at which we're going to start having some real numbers to look at in terms of what it would cost to fulfill the city's goals with regard to the project. But we're not there yet. And so saying how much we're willing to spend before we know how much it's going to cost puts us in kind of an uncomfortable spot. Is there, how would you sort of game out the timing of how these two tracks come together? How much do we want to spend? How much do we need to spend?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think to your point about the sort of the analogy to residential. So I think the number that John put forward is like, based on our past 5 years, we could probably ask for up to 8 million is what I'm taking. Is that right, John? It's sort of like, that wouldn't be a long shot necessarily. I don't think we should take up to 8 million. I think we should probably look at about half of that. And that's just, again, kind of ballpark look, because I think that feels safe. That retains, I think, it feels conservative that should we see a decline in revenue, that our existing services would not be impacted by that. And so that's, I guess, what I would be looking for today would be just sort of a head nod of like, yeah, Layla, go ahead and look at what 3 to 4 million looks like. That starts to, with the other revenue sources we have, or resources we have for the project, starts to paint a ballpark estimate that we can then start to work with our architect on. And it isn't to say we're going to spend out that whole thing, but it at least starts to give us a starting point for them to say that we're not looking at an $8 million building. You know, we think we roughly have about this. Start designing something to that. And then once we get the cost estimate, that's when we can say kind of, we have this much money, the cost estimate is here, now we got to reconcile the two. And that could mean value engineering and moving the dial down, or that could mean that, okay, we're X off and these are the things we want. And so now we'll tick this side of it up. So what it starts to do is by kind of having that tolerance levels to say, yeah, we could comfortably borrow 8 million. I'm guessing most of this council doesn't want to do that. So if you're comfortable with me looking at 3 to 4 million, if I see this, you're not committed to that. And I think we need to make that really clear to everybody who's watching. Like, we're not committing to a number. What we're trying to do is give me something I can start to work with and see how would a $3 to $4 million debt service fit in to our budget, so that when I bring you a budget proposal, I can say, I'm proposing you increase general fund expenditures by X for the next 5 years. And, you know, I can start to develop a plan that you can respond to in the context of all of the items you've brought up tonight. How does this fit in with other projects? How will this affect our current level of service? And my approach would be, it doesn't affect our current level of service. We maintain our existing level of service. We try to maintain a similar expenditures we did last year, knowing it's going to have to go up somewhat to account for debt service. But I tend to look at these things very conservatively. So I think I fit in here pretty well. But that's kind of what I'm hoping to get. So it is chicken and egg a little bit, but what it does do is it really starts to give us a starting point for discussion with our architect, and like, you know, and I'm saying if we have like a $5 million budget, I tell them it's 4. Like we work it that way too. So does that help sort of frame it up a little bit better for you?
Yeah, it helps certainly, and I think you know, obviously we're not committing to a number today, as opposed to expressing a general range. But I think it's a good idea for us to get out our anxieties, even within that range or about that range on the front end. So I'm glad we're having this discussion. One of the things I think I saw on your screen was what kind of guideposts or parameters should we have in place for determining what we're comfortable with. And for me, and I suspect for several counselors, one of them is really hard to calculate, but it's basically just because we don't have to go to the voters for this kind of financing, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be guided by what the voters can tolerate. We represent the voters, and so trying to come up with a number that I can tolerate, but that I also think a majority of the voters can tolerate. That's tricky calculation, but I do think it's a worthy undertaking. You know, we have a general sense of where the public stands on the cost of this project, but we don't have a very specific sense. But still, I think that's one of the guideposts. And so trying to calculate that, there's no magic formula, but that's weighing on me, or it's in my head. And then the other thing is that I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it sounded like from a report we got from you that there's reason to be somewhat optimistic about the sale of the old City Hall. Seemed to be a little bit more quick interest than I was expecting. I mean, I'm sure it's still a long, slow process, but do you have any news to offer us on that?
No, just folks are still interested and looking. I believe there's at least 1, possibly 2 folks that are active. But I think probably Hans would be better resource than me in terms of opining on, you know, how long these things usually take. I know they're not as quick as say, a residential home in Manzanita these days. But Hans, I don't know if you have any other thoughts you want to throw in.
Well, they can. Commercial property has moved quickly over the last year and a half here. But there is a lot of due diligence involved. I have a feeling that the old, people keep calling that an old gas station, and it really wasn't, I don't believe. I think it was a service station, and there is a subtle difference. So I think people perceive that there were, multiple gas tanks buried there, and as opposed to a machine shop or a repair facility. So I know that there's some due diligence concerns, but to be honest, I have avoided touching City Hall, the old City Hall property, at all costs. I have not mentioned it to clients who will probably get mad at me that I haven't said, hey, you should get into the City Hall investigation and get another broker to help you. I have not told anybody about it. I don't want any conflict of interest. I don't know any of the interested parties. I've heard that there are a couple, but I don't know who they are. I haven't talked to Valerie, the listing agent, about it. But I am working with clients on other possibilities in Manzanita in the commercial core, and there is strong interest right now. Our list price is not unreasonable, but it is at the top of the market. It's somewhat high. And so that's probably going to slow some people down too, but a commercial buyer is going to be willing to make an offer below list if they're really interested.
Let me throw in a couple of thoughts here if I could. I was going to try to talk earlier. I realized I've been on mute through the whole thing, so that's why you couldn't hear me. I went back and revisited the needs assessment report that we had done a few years ago, which has a lot of detail in it. There's about 8 or 9 different options in there on how to build a city hall that we were really involved in, a few years ago when we were into this before. And each one of these options provide great detail: square footage, cost of furniture, funding sources, and so forth. And if you look through that, I think we're down to, at least for me, and I sense just in conversations with everybody, that the community is going to be comfortable in about the $5 million range. And we sell at City Hall, and with the existing funds that we have in the fund right now, we're basically would have, let's say round numbers, $1.5 million immediately, and would have to borrow 3.5. And this is basically our immediate needs option number 2 from that assessment report. And the next one is number 3 is long range for 20 years needs. It's a little bit more. Obviously, numbers have changed. Cost of materials have gone up. We have inflation. We're going to have to do a little jockeying around. It's not going to come out exactly as we were looking at this a couple of years ago, but I think it's a good place to start. It's a good place to start for the people that we get on our team working on this, to take a look at those 2 options and see if we can get anywhere close to those kind of square footage numbers and build something and in that $5 million area, and see what the heck we got. And then we're going to have to adjust one way or the other till we get to the final number. I mean, we're not committing to anything here, but I think that's the area where we're at.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And before we still have another hour to keep talking, but I do want to be mindful of John's time, and I know he was doing some math, and just see if there's any last questions for him so that he can exit gracefully.
Great, thank you. I think it was maybe Councilor Nuttall that was, or maybe Mr. Spegman, who was asking about debt service of $155,000 a year. And that would cover between $2.25 and $2.5 million of borrowing at current rates, repaid over 20 years. It probably would get you, more like 3 or higher if you were repaying over 30, but you'd be paying, obviously a lot more interest by extending another 10 years.
Thanks, John. And I'll work with John too to run a few options. And part of what, so just before he signs off, did anyone have any other questions? And certainly if stuff comes up, Council, after this, send me an email. I can work with John to get an answer to it. So this is, there's never not an opportunity to ask for more information. So.
I just have one quick question for John. I'm assuming once we come up with parameters and we're talking about kind of a general amount, you will come back to us with options on financing so that we may have 2 or 3 options to look at in terms of financing the number we come up with?
Typically, yeah.
Okay, because I think that will help a lot. And just in terms of numbers, having worked with those for a long time, it seems like 3 to 4 million is a pretty reasonable amount to look for in our financing, just based on history and the downsizing of what we originally wanted to do. So that, I think that's really helpful. So thank you, John.
You're all very welcome.
Great.
Any other questions? A minute for John, or on anything else on this discussion? Do you have anything else you wanted to say, Hans, other than what you said about City Hall? I mean,
Yeah, I'd like to pick up with what Jerry was talking about and express my agreement. I want to make it really clear, I hope I have before, that voter input has had a significant influence on me, on my hopes and expectations for what this facility looks like, especially in terms of its size. And so I'm sympathetic to that, and I believe that it will have a profound impact compared to what we were looking at 2 years ago, both maybe in terms of the quality of the building and its design, but certainly its square footage. And pandemic has had an impact on some of those needs as well, that hopefully can be dialed down somewhat. I'm going to risk tolerance. My risk tolerance is average, I would say. Personally, it's unreasonably high, but I've been lucky, I guess, with that. But as a counselor, it's pretty average, and I think it's tempered by other assets that the city has. We've talked about the fact that I think there's, if not consensus, a group interest in potentially selling the old fire station property. And there's some serious value there. And there are also other possibilities up there at Underhill as well, just with the acreage and the amount of property that's there and the demand right now for both commercial and residential property. So knowing that we have some of those assets and the debt service going away in 7 years on the Underhill land purchase, I feel confident that the numbers that we've been talking about, the big hope is when we start talking to people in construction and architecture about, dialing that building down in size, then factoring in inflation and costs, and what can we do for 4 million or 3.5 million or 5 million, whatever that number is. So I am sympathetic to making sure voters understand that they've been heard and they're going to have an impact. But while I'm doing that, I'll go ahead and aggravate a small group of voters, which I've been doing for years. I think I've been on record as saying that I really don't understand why our SDCs are so low. And as a developer and a realtor and somebody who knows people who build houses regularly, both for themselves and for clients, there is an ability, if not an appetite, there's an ability for these folks to pay more, for lack of a better word, for system development charges. And our former city manager was reluctant, and he had various reasons why, to pursue those, mostly appropriately based in law. So there's obviously some due diligence to do there, but I really think the city should be charging more for whatever they can within the limits of law for developing these systems of sewer and water system and all of these. The money is there, and we should be charging it. So that group of voters can start writing me letters right now.
I do think that Hans brings up a really good point, and I don't know how you do this, but it seems to me that we should be on a parallel path about revenue streams at the same time we're making these decisions about what our tolerance might be, because there is a lot, system development charges are just one potential revenue stream. There are others out there, and I think we all know of several. So how do we? And I guess I'm looking to Layla, but how do we do these in a parallel path, considering the resources that we don't have? And I think without, I mean, who's going to go to the end and say, okay, I'm willing to go here, even though I don't know what the potentials are on the other side in terms of creating more money. And to be honest with you, when the mayor says, I'll be honest with you, Mayor, when you say 5 million, I'm going, oh, you know, and I don't know if that's because I've gotten old and I'm remembering days gone by, or it just seems like that's a lot of money for what I'm envisioning in my mind. And I think both are true. That today's economy and today's cost aren't what they used to be, right? And so you're spending $3 or $4 or $5 million to get what essentially is a modest building. And it seems crazy, but I guess that's true.
Yeah, no, there's a great point about trying to figure out what the other revenue streams are. And what I would suggest is that we won't solve that. We won't have the answer to that before we decide what our tolerance is. But I think naming it and being actively pursuing what those revenue streams should be, because otherwise I think we'll get locked into just sort of this conundrum I feel like we've been in probably for a number of years. So I think that that's a really great point, and why we need to sort of, why I figured that this conversation would sort of unearth other things, is that we need to figure out how to pay for this with our existing resources, and then and continue to, and in parallel, do our best to also try to find supplemental resources for infrastructure and other needs. And I think Jim's here today too, and he can probably talk a little bit about this, but I know that $5 million number is like, it's a big one, and I totally hear you too. But with the state of construction, the way that it is now, you know, if we had proceeded with this building 2 years ago, we would be getting a lot more for the money. That's just obvious. The pandemic, the impacts on construction, the peculiarities of being at the coast generally have also exacerbated those costs. And so I think that's probably where the sense of urgency in my mind comes from in terms of being a steward of public money, is that the longer we wait, the more it's going to cost and the less we're going to get. And that's going to be really evident when we get our first cost estimate and we compare that back to what y'all did in 2018. There's going to be a massive difference between that. And I think the public needs to get ready, and they need to be prepared, and they need to be educated on the fact that construction costs have escalated extremely high. For no matter what you were doing on that site, the costs are exponentially higher than they were 2 years ago. And we just got to come correct about that. Like, it's the reality. So Jim, I don't know if there's anything you can offer there, but I think it's just the reality is we're going to get a lot less for more. And the longer we wait, the more things get smaller and the cost gets bigger. And that's
Layla,
market dynamic.
Before you move on to Jim, I just want to be clear, because it probably sounds like, you know, I'm out looking for money like I'm gold miner or something. And that's not really what I'm professing. What I'm trying to suggest is I'm a firm believer in cost recovery.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in cost recovery for things that we do that do not have a significant public benefit. And that relates a lot of times to construction, and it relates to a lot of other things. If you're going to do something, or you want to do something where there's a limited public benefit to the whole, then you should be paying for that service, or you should be paying for that development. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in terms of revenue streams, not just going out and trying to tax people to death or trying to find ways to get money out of folks. This, to me, there's an accountability that needs to go with desire. And so, and you know that because you've heard me talk about it a million times, but cost recovery, cost recovery, cost recovery. And let the people who get benefit make the pay, pay the way.
Yeah,
So
you're speaking to my heart. Thank you. Yeah, Jim, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that or just be like, yeah.
You said, I agree with everything you said, Layla. I'll just express, I know $5 million is a lot of money. And I'm not saying that I'm not suggesting that we're locked on 5 million, but I'm just using it as an example. I'll just tell you already, I can look at the goals and objectives that have been expressed by the city or the previous efforts of the city. And I believe if we set, let's say, a $5 million budget, we will be it will be imperative for us, no matter what budget we do, that we prioritize our goals and objectives 1 through X. And it will not surprise me whatsoever as we go through this process that we will not be able to achieve all the goals and objectives, even at $5 million for the city hall. And we're going to have to make hard decisions as we go through this design process about what's important for the facility to provide and what features and redundancies and resiliency factors are incorporated into the facility. And so I also will say I would be very nervous. I understand totally this chicken and egg kind of conversation, but in my experience, it has worked better for us to set a general budget outline, and which does not mean it's an open checkbook or even express the full budget to the contracted partners, but we don't want to go into this kind of open-ended saying, what are our goals and objectives, and let's price this out and find out what this cost is, because the cost for sure will be in a value engineering or budget reduction process. And so it would be helpful to us as we lead that team to have kind of parameters about what the city's desire is, or goals are in regards to budget.
Well, so I'm certainly comfortable expressing a support for a range as long as we do 2 things we've talked about tonight. One is, and Layla, you have already said this out loud a couple of times in public, but really clarify that we are going to aggressively examine alternate funding streams or increasing existing funding streams so that we do not have the imbalance that we currently have in how we run this city. We are way too dependent on one particular source of revenue, and everybody knows it, and it is causing a lot of grief among the public for various reasons. And so I just think that we talk about it a lot. We've had, Steve and I have had private conversations. Layla, you've had good conversations with Steve, with myself, with others. You've talked about it in public meetings. We just have to commit to putting in that effort. And I know it's going to take a lot of folks on this call and others not on this call to make that happen. So I look forward to that. I also look forward to, and maybe it's again just me, but I personally need to get smarter about what our other infrastructure needs are. Neither of those prevent me from being comfortable with a range at this point, but I would be uncomfortable in a month or 6 weeks or whatever voting on a hard number without knowing that there's been some progress on those 2 fronts. And then the only other comment I want to make, and this is not to dispute what you said, Layla, I fully agree with you that the passage of time has resulted in increased costs, but I just don't want that message to be misinterpreted to mean that people should have voted differently 2 years ago. They voted the way they voted for very good, solid reasons. And honestly, if we had built what was proposed 2 years ago, construction costs might have been cheaper, but it would be a whole different project than we are currently contemplating right now. So no doubt about it, we have to deal with the changes that have been visited upon society by inflation, but also COVID has resulted in other changes that are going to make it perhaps easier to cut some of that square footage. So I think we're all equally unsure of what we're doing here. So we're trying to be as sure as possible. But I personally, the range that has been mentioned in terms of tolerance for debt. I would certainly be more tolerant on the 3 end than the 4 end, but if that range allows us to move forward, as long as we can get some of these other items more clear in the near term, alternate revenue sources and status of other infrastructure projects, I'd be pretty comfortable.
Anybody else have any comments today? Do you have anything else you wanted to say, Linda? You've been kind of quiet this afternoon.
No, I agree. I agree with Jerry on many of the points he's made. For me, in working on this project, I think there is a component that's really important to keep in mind, and that's scalability. We may want to have this big building, or like I'm envisioning a way to have community projects and maybe other things going on the outside, and that would take maybe a change in some of the components we need to put into the building. But if we think we can't do that now, but down the road when we have money to do that, we can. And so it seems to me the scalability is really critical as we look at this project.
Ability to phase in scope that's not affordable at this point. And
Right.
it's something we do frequently with projects. It's not an uncommon situation to be in, to have goals and desires greater than our budget. And that's a great point. A good design team will be able to help guide us on what areas make sense to phase. Yeah.
Is there, did you get kind of some input from us today, Layla, on what you're looking for, you think?
Yeah, I think, no, this is great conversation. I feel like I've got general support from the council to explore sort of a $3 to $4 million range. So I'm going to start doing that. And I think as we move forward with the budget process, some clarity on kind of cost recovery options, kind of what the path is for looking at additional funding mechanisms. So what I'll do is sort of work with myself at the moment to sort of put together a schedule of like what I think that long-term revenue committee looks like and what that might look like and how that stacks up against this timeline. And I think that the point is well taken. I do want to clarify, I did not mean to imply in any way, shape, or form that the voters were wrong. The voters were right. They did what they voted, and that's correct. My point was that timing is really important, and thinking about as we move forward, it's just going to cost us more. And so we just kind of have to be really cognizant of that. But I do think it's important to note that, we do know that short-term rentals, that's the big elephant in the room, right, are the major source of funding in this town. There's some real livability issues that are impacting folks here. We have to find an alternate source if that becomes, we need to find an alternate source to that if that becomes something that eventually becomes limited. Because while we're in a great position to support our existing service levels, any kind of expansion or the expansion of infill does increase costs. And I think we all well know that the average $175 that people pay per year to the city on their property taxes probably isn't going to cut it. And so I just think that folks out there too that have a lot of concern about how much money is generated from short-term rentals really also need to be very cognizant that there has to be an alternate funding source in order to maintain the service levels that we have. So that's super important to me as well, and will be part of what we look forward to. But I feel like this has been really great conversation. I feel like I have general consensus to sort of start exploring this. And as I start to piece this together, I'll be coming back to you with more information as we move forward. But my ultimate goal, and we won't have probably, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we will have a cost estimate by the time the budget gets adopted in June. It's possible, but for the 30% design cost estimate, I'm not sure we'll be there by June. But what I do think we need to have by June, and I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page here, is I do think it'll be essential for us to have a debt service number in that budget so that if we do advance, we have that already built into our budget. So I'd hoped when I started here last year that that work had been done, but here we are. So that's my goal. And I just want to make sure everyone here is really clear with that and is supportive of that, or if you have concerns about that, to please talk to me, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. But that's the idea. And then once we get to kind of the final cost estimate, that's the point, council has to pass a resolution. You have to go through all these steps in order to actually approve the loan. And I would say, let's say for some crazy reason we don't get there, that money is just going into the city hall fund. So it'll just still be used to pay for a new city hall, but we've at least set ourselves up to be able to pay that debt service if we end up taking the debt out this next fiscal year, but this calendar year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
So,
Leila, just so
go
it's
ahead, Steve.
just so it's clear, and I think you kind of said it here just moments ago, but our discussion here today is not involving going out and asking the voters for more money by some kind of a special bond issue or a levy issue, in the sense that they're going to start paying additional monies. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about working a system that we can make these payments, paying back the loan within the current monies that we have. And so the voters themselves will not see any additional fund request. They may see some additional fees if we look at alternative revenue and find that we're undercharging for services, for example, like systems development charges. But I think it's clear, we should make it clear, because it gets confusing. We may all understand what's being said here, but not everybody will. And so we need to make it clear that we're living within our current means, essentially, in what we're talking about today.
I couldn't have said it better myself, so I'm just going to leave it at that, but that's exactly right.
I just wanted to confirm, Leila, that our current schedule doesn't show us having a 30% budget till mid-July.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I figured that. You're a little.
Okay, if nobody has any other questions, it's a great discussion this afternoon. It's about 4:30. I'm going to adjourn and we'll take a break for dinner and see everybody back at 6. Does that work for everybody? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.